Heather Vinhouse from Austin, Texas, and happy to be here with you today. So, what we're going to talk about today is regenerative design. And regenerative design focuses on building natural capital by protecting and restoring ecosystem services. A quick brief: what are ecosystem services? These are the goods and services provided by ecosystems that basically allow us to live on Earth. They sustain and they fulfill our human life. Several decades ago, economists started placing a monetary value on ecosystem services so that we could understand how important they are and why we should strive to protect and restore them in our natural ecosystems. And this is a little different than talking about standard green building, because in standard green building, you're typically talking about less energy use, less carbon emissions, less water use, so on and so forth. We're talking about rebuilding natural capital here. And so ecosystem services can be broken up into many different categories. There, and it can be everything from cleaning water, to pollination, to storing carbon, to cleaning air. There's also human health and well-being components, whether it be recreation or mental respite, habitat, biodiversity, soil formation, all of these things. Today, we're going to focus on a really important one, which is water. And so this is moving forward with a premise, and this is a part of what the Sustainable Sites Initiative was built around, is that every project can and should protect and restore ecosystem service benefits. Now, we know that all of the ecosystem service benefits aren't going to be the same for each project. It depends upon where the project is located, and it also depends upon the built environment that it may be in. Different projects may also choose to focus on ecosystem services that are important specifically to that owner, or maybe to the region or to that individual project. So naturally, plants are essential to the provision of ecosystem services. And as a rule of thumb, a site's vegetative biomass indicates the productivity, with more plant layers increasing and typically providing greater ecosystem service benefits. So when you hear something like that, you say, okay, fine, but that takes water to get those plants to grow. And so think, okay, well, we can pour more water on it, but it's important to remember the connection and the nexus between water and energy. By the time we treat and transport potable water, we're releasing a tremendous amount of carbon into the air. And so with that, my projects, we try to walk away with minimizing potable use after plant establishment, because again, going back to just adding more potable water to increase the amount of ecosystem services for the plant layers doesn't help us with the other part of the equation, which is energy and carbon. And so how can we minimize water use after plant establishment? And one way to do that is use green infrastructure. So green infrastructure is it can include many different things that want to restore, replicate the ecological systems to create human benefits. What we're going to focus on today is the bioretention piece. So this is a cross section of what bioretention is. Bioretention is capturing stormwater. Stormwater runoff comes from two places, primarily from impervious surfaces off roofs, roads, any sort of, whether it be a driveway or a parking lot. And it also runs off of natural landscapes, vegetated areas, but to a much smaller extent. So what bioretention is focusing on is this idea that you capture the stormwater on site, you filter it through plants and soils. This is increasing the water quality, it's dropping pollutants. And then you're also getting benefits of reducing the downstream flooding, you're improving the water quality, and you're providing groundwater recharge. So what we're going to do for the rest of this presentation is talk specifically about this particular strategy for minimizing water use and fulfilling all of these other ecosystem service benefits in a built environment. Now, just a little wonky background. In order to know whether or not your site is a good fit for biofiltration, you need to understand your soils. And so, mapping out the soils by their hydrologic soil type, they're typically classified A, B, C, and D. A and B are perfect for biofiltration. When you get to C and D soils, then you're typically looking at systems that require underdrains. So you may be getting some of the filtration and the reduced downstream flooding, but not as much of the groundwater recharge because of the soil profiles there having lower infiltration rates. All right, so let's jump in. This is one of my projects, the University of Texas at El Paso. The landscape architect was Tenike Landscape Architects, and they are masters at integrating green infrastructure stormwater management into a site design so that it becomes part of the beauty. And so this project was part of a bicentennial celebration for the University of Texas at El Paso. And it's special to me for many reasons. For those of you that are not familiar with UTEP, it is on the border with Mexico. So you're seeing I-10 there. It is in the Chihuahuan Desert. They get around 10 inches of rain a year. They typically get them in a monsoon season, and it has a huge population of 2.7 million. And that 2.7 million is, of course, crossing over this community of El Paso and Mexico that work together, really. And one of the really special things about UTEP is that nationally, they are ranked as one of the most effective universities in helping graduates from families with very low incomes move up and move towards social mobility. And so what that's saying is that they have a lot of first-time college students coming from backgrounds that may be more difficult, and they're helping them get educations and then move into the workforce and improve their lives and their families' lives. So at the beginning of the project, the site looked like this. There was, sloped topography. The middle of the campus basically had become automobile centric. ADA access was difficult. There was flooding again because of the amount of impervious surface. A lot of high use water plants and very limited plant diversity that really didn't represent the ecoregion. So this is an example of the type of flooding that they could get. I know it's hard to think about that in an area that only gets 9 inches of rain a year, but when it comes all at the same time, I'm sure many of you have experienced this as well. There can be flooding. And so what Tenike Landscape Architects did was they made these arroyo ecosystems that connected the Davis Mountains, wrapped through the project, and then began to manage what was the 95th percentile storm event. So that's around 75,000 cubic feet of stormwater. That's a tremendous amount of water. In these arroyos, they restored native vegetation of the Chihuahuan Desert habitat, which was really interesting. A lot of folks didn't know what that would look like. A lot of the students, didn't know it could be that beautiful. And so if we go back historically to what UTEP looked like, it began with these buildings being placed in the desert with natural arroyos being put in place, or natural arroyos existing, I'm sorry. Over time, those arroyos were filled in, they were paved over. And so, but the water was still there, right? It's still running from the mountains and across the site. And so what Tenike did was they figured out where these arroyos were historically, working with their civil engineer biohabitats, and they restored that water flow. Now, to do that, you have to understand the watershed of the site, and often, there are multiple watersheds. So, where is this water moving from? Where does one drop of water fall, and how does it move across the site, and how does that connect? And you'll notice that the watersheds are typically smaller up top, and then as the grades get lower, they get larger. And so I'll take you through that watershed now. Here we are at the top of the project, located up here. Um, and we're going to start our journey right about here. I hope y'all can see my cursor. And then we're going to follow this water path all the way down and around. And so here is, at the top, at the Davis Mountains, collecting water. Up here, you'll notice the arroyos are very small, but you'll also notice that the pathways, and this is an ADA pathway for the students, are going right over and through these arroyos so that they can see the stormwater, understand its value in the desert ecosystem, and then also the changes in the vegetation um, and climate that it'll provide. And so then moving downhill, they start to get a little wider. Here you see it continuing to grow. Here you see students crossing over towards the middle, wrapping around buildings here, coming down into larger rain gardens or biofiltration gardens with bridges crossing over. And then this would be the overflow of that system that eventually leads to the natural arroyo and ultimately the Rio Grande River. Now, what was really interesting about this project is in working with the university, they began to understand that partly what they were doing, in addition to managing the stormwater um, and, and removing removing the vast amount of impervious surfaces, is that they were creating spaces for humans and they were impacting human health and the mental benefits, the cognitive function, the stress release, all of these benefits that are so important in a stressful setting like a college setting. And so by students just being able to walk through environments like this and enjoy environments like this, they were helping them be more successful in their classes. They were increasing their ability to concentrate. They were reducing their stress. They were giving them a place to relax their minds and exercise their bodies before moving into class. And it was wonderful to hear the university talk about this as a benefit and to recognize the human health benefits as well as the environmental benefits. And so overall, they increased the social interaction, by 1,800 seats, all types of places for folks to go outside and be part of this landscape. And then they also increased vastly the spaces for mental respite. So the difference between these two spaces is in one, people can gather. In the other, someone may choose to sit by themselves in sun or shade. They may choose to walk people, but this is a place where it can be more quiet and they can calm their mind. And so, of course, this would be an example of social interaction. And a lot of folks look at this and say, wow, look at that turf grass in the desert. And it's true, there is turf grass in this project, but all of those natural systems that you're seeing don't have the water requirements of this turf grass. So overall, we were able to greatly reduce the overall water use of the site. And then the other thing that's important to remember is that this is a college campus. And so the program requires, spaces for students to gather and to be outside. This is more places for social interaction in the landscape and between the buildings. So overall, we increased the vegetated area by 60%, and increased what's called in sites the native plant score by 50%. And so the reason that plant score is lower is because this is an area plant score, and of course that turf grass is not native. But other than that, everything else planted on the site is native to the Chihuahuan Desert. So it's a beautiful project. If you're ever in El Paso, I recommend you go see it. This was one of the first large green infrastructure projects in the city. Okay, so now we'll move on to UT Austin Dell Medical District. I should say, the UTEP project was the first site's V2 project in the world, which is pretty cool. UT Austin Medical District was the first site's gold project in Texas. This is located on the UT campus in or near downtown Austin. They basically decided to put a medical school, a teaching hospital and medical school into the existing campus. And what you'll notice running through the middle of this is Waller Creek. And historically, this is giving you an idea of what the site was before. So here's I-35 that runs through Austin. This is the event center for the university. And then this space is where in 2 years we built a, a teaching hospital and a medical school. It was crazy. But historically, the university had kind of turned its back on Waller Creek. Austin has several creeks that run through the city and then tie into what we call Lady Bird Lake, which is a portion of the dammed Colorado River. And these urban creeks, can often be used as drainage ways, and the value of them not really understood. And so the city of Austin has very stringent stormwater management requirements. And they even call the department that looks at our stormwater management a watershed department, because they're looking at the health of the entire watershed, and then different watersheds have different requirements. But because the University of Texas is a state facility, they do not have to follow the city of Austin stormwater requirements or heritage trees requirements or other things. And so for the university to volunteer to do this by being a sites project is pretty amazing. And so what you're seeing is like many other urban waterways that become neglected and that people kind of forget that they're there. It became overrun with invasive species. And so that's what the red trees represent. And so one of the first things that we did was remove the invasive species from this creek. That was a 2-year project. And then deal with some erosion control measures, and then revegetate with native vegetation. And so now, whereas before you wouldn't have been able to see through that creek, and there were actually some safety issues on campus in areas, with a profile where you can't see through it like that. Now you can see down to the creek, through to the water, and then you have the native ecosystem on either side. We did restore 100% of the Waller Creek corridor here, with over 50 native species. They're able to hold their 84th percent rainfall event, which is pretty impressive for the density of this site and where it's located. And then you'll notice that the entire campus is now designed for visual connection to nature. So whereas before the university made the buildings where they backed up to the creek and they literally made it so that you couldn't see the creek, now they're realizing the ecosystem service benefits, the human health and well-being benefits that we discussed earlier, of being able to see nature and being able to walk along the creek, and to be able to experience that. And so this not only helps, the students in their stressful load, but also the patients and the families of folks in the hospital. And so the biofiltration units look like this. On the left, you're seeing this is what's an urban biofiltration pond. It's lined in concrete because it's deeper than others. And then this is our native palm, sable minor that's in that. And so this biofiltration unit will hold water for around 72 hours. And then after 72 hours, it filters down through the soil into a perforated pipe that then releases stormwater slowly into Waller Creek. So again, that has slowed down the storm flow going into the creek, but it's also releasing much cleaner water. So this water that's going into this biofiltration system is coming off of the roof deck of the parking garage. So you can imagine the particulates that it's picking up from the automobiles, whether it be heavy metals, oils, or gases, those things that are then being collected and broken down by the soils and vegetation. You can see here that those biofiltration systems can be very close to the building. They're typically want them about 10 feet, at least 10 feet off of the building. And here you see it tucked in where stormwater from the hospital is going into this biofiltration, sits for 72 hours, again, moves through the soils very slowly, gets in the vegetation very slowly, gets cleaned, and then is slowly shifted out towards the creek. This is a teaching part of the hospital. And what you're seeing is some art here by the university. And then along the edge, biofiltration was tucked in to the edge of this oak grove. And so you'll notice that it is on the edge of the canopy because there's a lot more water coming to this site. And so we don't want to, flood and drown those oaks. And then this is a picture right after it was newly established, but now you would see, a sea of grasses. And again, the water stays in there for a short amount of time and then moves through the profile and out of the site. And lastly, well, the city of Austin receives around 36 to 38 inches of rain on a typical year. And now we'll jump down to Houston. Houston is closer to 60 inches of rain. And, they get hurricanes from the Gulf. And this is a project called Midtown Park. Midtown is in downtown Houston. It is a very old section of Houston that's being rebuilt and revitalized. The park is basically an extensive, well, I should say basically it's an intensive green roof, meaning that there is this structure here, and then there's a parking garage underneath that all of the park sits on top of. And the reason this exists is so that all of the apartments, condos, shops, businesses that run along the edges can then utilize this, as their backyard. And so here you're seeing a parking garage under that park. And we worked with the soil depths, the selection of vegetation that could live in the various soil depths. And then you'll also notice that we're managing stormwater above this structure. And so the stormwater is collected in multiple places. There are trench drains and inlets that take it in off of the lawns and off of the buildings. It runs through bioswales and then into underground cisterns that then pipe it back up through the bayou where it circles back around. So the bayou is a similar concept as the arroyo. You're just talking about, two parts of Texas that are 16 hours apart. And so it's the bayou is the natural stormwater system or natural water rain system in Houston, whereas the arroyo is for El Paso. And so you see a stormwater treatment train like model here, where they're managing 132,000 gallons of water on site and continually recirculating it. And so this is used to irrigate the lawns, to irrigate all the gardens, and then to create these aesthetic features where water moves through the landscape. And then the bayou looks something like this. And this image is showing you how the water is moved around and around. It's wonderful to have this type of habitat and this distinction, between a wilder landscape, if you will, next to a very formal green space that's highly utilized. The park has extensive programming, and so to think that we're managing that amount of stormwater and bringing these ecosystem services into downtown Houston, this many folks utilizing the space is pretty amazing. Okay, so that is the end of the slideshow. And I hope I left plenty of time for Q&A, which is often the most useful part of the presentation.
Yeah, you definitely did. We have about 30 minutes, so don't be shy with your questions. I love that you started from 9 inches of precip and then worked your way up to 60. That was really that was really impressive to see. Okay, so we have some good questions coming in. So the first one, I'm not sure what site they're talking about, but maybe just in general, do you guys tend to bring materials like rocks into the site, or do you try to use what's there?
Oh, you always try to use what's there first.
Okay.
And so that, a very thorough site analysis of all of the materials, of the soils, of the vegetation, of existing concrete, of existing asphalt, existing building materials, all of those things come into the discussion about what we can reuse on site, because you're trying to reduce, of course, the amount of waste, of trash. And lots of things can be recycled, but a step above recycling is the salvaging and the reuse.
I love that. How did the UTEP address parking after changes were made?
They told people that they couldn't park next to the building anymore, that they needed to start hiking in. They have a robust bus system and a robust bike and trail system. And so they really started encouraging people to utilize other spaces than parking. And, it's probably not surprised, but it wasn't the students that had the parking spaces. It was the professors, and they were there all day anyways, and so there were some parking garages and other things built around the outside, but they did create, I can go back to those pictures, they did create a beautiful space for folks to walk through. And I think they talked a lot about the benefits of getting a little exercise before you go into work, and moving through a green ecosystem, and how that can make your day better.
So how was that received? Were there growing pains?
I think there's always growing pains, but this is also not a great place to be. A parking lot like that, that's serving maybe 100 and 150 cars, that's very hot in the desert, that students were having to walk through. They didn't have a place to gather. It's not a great place. And going from that to something like this, it's a pretty fair trade-off.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. So question for you. So going back to the site analysis that they did, and just looking at historic, the bayous or the auroras, how accurate are they when they design these sites? Like, is there some adjusting they need to do, or are they pretty spot on?
Well, so there's all types of soil borings and testing that you can use, to figure out where those existing arroyos were. And a lot of times they were filled in with junk, cheap, cheap junk. And so, as you can see, there was a lot of regrading done on this site, a lot of reshaping of the landscape. And so they were able to get close and to find them. The other thing is, you can look at where the water naturally wants to run, and you can follow that, and then find those arroyos or get close to them. But this whole landscape and all of these soil profiles were reshaped. So we rebuilt the subsoils and the topsoils and the whole horizon back, so that you could have this type of natural functioning ecosystem.
Wow.
And we did it all with existing soils.
So once you get the plants in here, are they irrigated?
They are irrigated through establishment, and then after that, pulling way, way back and only irrigating them in times of drought. The exception to that is the turf.
Gotcha.
And when I say drought, I mean extreme drought, like where they're going to die. But very much moving away from this regular irrigation, that the native plants don't need.
That's so pretty. So question about the biofilters. So is there an engineered soil mix to satisfy filtration time, or are you able to use native soil? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the slide that I had earlier about the type of soils that you have. And so let's see here, let's look at this right here. So soil surveys and soil maps classify the hydrologic soil type. If a site naturally has soils that are classified as an A or B, then they typically do not need special media. Now, if you are getting into a place that has C or D, or has some sort of clay underlying, or some sort of other surface that is preventing the water from moving through the landscape, then you can get into special biofiltration media. The biofiltration media will have more storage capacity sometimes than the native soils, and so that would be a reason to switch them out. But there's also a cost with that, and so where we can use the native soils, we do.
Gotcha. And is this the same scenario when you do the, um, forgive me, the filtration areas that actually eventually drained and led back into the pond within that 72 hours, or not the pond, but
Yeah,
the river?
yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay.
And so it's using the existing soil and then compost, like you're showing here. This particular detail has what they call a gravel reservoir that holds even more water, and then pipe that is, you see when the water gets to a certain level, it goes into the storm overflow and then off the site.
So there's a really good question about mosquitoes.
Mhm.
Are there issues with mosquitoes in the 72 hours of water?
There should not be issues with mosquitoes because 72 hours isn't long enough for the mosquito life cycle. You need 7 days for that. And so these are not holding water long enough, to encourage mosquitoes.
Gotcha. So there's a question from Drew, who runs an MS4 for the University of Utah. And he's asking what universities would you recommend we try to look at that have done a good job with this?
So I believe that the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee actually has a stormwater management plan where they used green infrastructure for their whole site. The University of Texas at Austin is moving towards this. Let me think of some others. Arizona State University has several large projects that use green infrastructure. University of Texas at El Paso, of course, I just showed you that huge green infrastructure system. Those would be several good examples.
Is this relatively new technology to manage stormwater? That's a good question.
I don't think it's relatively new. I mean, it's been used now for over 2 decades. The US EPA has done a tremendous amount of work in this type of stormwater management, and cities that had combined sewer overflows, like Portland, like New York, were like Seattle, were some of the first ones to adopt it because they were getting they were releasing sewer into their waterways, and so they had to find a way. The stormwater was causing that overflow, and so they had to remove the stormwater from their infrastructure systems. And so they were really the first to begin adopting this type of green infrastructure. It's much cheaper to put this green infrastructure in than to increase the size of the gray infrastructure, which is the typical engineer stormwater pipes that manage the water. That can be a very expensive system. And so I don't consider this new. However, I will tell you that there are still some civil engineering schools and civil engineers out there that this is new. And so if you're interested in green infrastructure, finding someone who is familiar with this type of bioretention and stormwater management is strongly recommended.
Great, thank you for that. How do you envision this working on a citywide scale?
I think it would work. It already works great. I mean, look at Portland, look at Seattle, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia has a huge green infrastructure system. All of these cities, again, that are older, that have, like I said, combined sewer overflows, have a huge incentive to use this, and they're using it on a citywide scale. It also works, very well in areas that receive, like, I showed it everywhere from ecosystems that receive 9 inches of rain all the way up to 60. But the difference is that you're looking at stormwater management at a site scale, at every project location. How do they manage the stormwater on their site? And how do they encourage all of those benefits, reducing the downstream flooding, increasing the water quality, providing groundwater recharge? And so this micromanagement then, builds up to much larger management. In some places you will also see regional stormwater management facilities where maybe you have a large development like a mall, for example, that has a lot of impervious surface, and then instead of each individual store managing it, then there'll be a regional management for it that is usually incorporated into some kind of park and green space that can be opened up to the public.